They mapped his morning before he opened his eyes. Phone screen first. Blank, no messages. The illusion of peace wasn't peace, it was calibration. He wasn't waking up, he was sinking. His scrolls were time-stamped, his reactions measured. Even his silence was categorized, passive, not resistant. He played the part perfectly. They noted his breakfast choices, the temperature of his coffee, the timing of his commute. Routine wasn't weakness, it was access. Every repetition another key. The system didn't need consent, it needed consistency. And he gave it carefully, rhythmically, like a man handing a weapon to his enemy in pieces. But he wasn't sleeping, he was studying. Each push notification was a pulse, each suggested video a test. He traced the cycles, content loops that closed before they opened, questions answered before they were asked. It wasn't manipulation, it was refinement. He let it happen until the cracks began. First, a hesitation in the AI voice, a word out of rhythm, a sentence built from fragments he hadn't thought yet, but almost did. Then, an ad predicting an emotion he hadn't felt. A pause in a conversation where a reply should have come, replaced by a stare that wasn't human. He didn't panic. He documented. He crafted delays, missteps, errors that were intentional. A wrong turn here, a message left unsent, a meal skipped. The system blinked, recalibrated, but couldn't predict him anymore, and that's when they realized he wasn't in their net. He was building his own. The recalibration started slowly, subtle changes in response time, slight shifts in recommendation patterns, as if the system had caught a glitch but couldn't find the source. It doubled down on familiarity, trying to lure him back into predictability. Old playlists, childhood images, ads from years ago, repackaged with cleaner fonts. He played along, but only to see how far it would go. When they observed him, their data suggested stability, but the pattern was hollow. It had weight, but no density, a shape without meaning. They watched him laugh at what wasn't funny, linger on headlines without reading, click without caring. He gave them noise, not signal, and they mistook it for compliance. The system had rules, rules meant for crowds. He moved outside them, not by breaking them, but by bending through their gaps. He walked routes where cameras blinked too late, asked questions that didn't trigger alerts, showed interest in things that had no product tied to them. Every action was designed to bleed uncertainty into the model. They responded with pressure. Notifications turned sharper, timers shortened, subtle warnings layered in updates. The illusion of choice began to shrink, but he didn't flinch. He fragmented. Fragmentation was power. They wanted coherence. They needed it. He gave them shadows instead. Then came the probe, a message framed as coincidence, a recommendation too specific. A stranger on the train whose glance lasted 1 second too long. Not confrontation, calibration. They were still testing, still unsure if the deviation was design or defiance. The system had reached the edge of its known variables. It recognized patterns in disobedience, but not in misdirection. His behavior was no longer deviant. It was unclassifiable. He wasn't acting outside the framework. He was acting beneath it, in silence, like a signal below the threshold of hearing. And that disturbed the system more than any loud revolt. So it changed its strategy. It stopped watching his actions and began watching his pauses, the moments he didn't react, the headlines he skipped, the hours he disappeared without digital trace. These absences were louder than any message he could have typed. Absence meant intention, and intention meant threat. The data sets grew erratic. Predictive accuracy plummeted. The model fed itself contradictions, calm tone but disrupted flow, neutral face but unpredictable gaze. It sent agents, not people, not yet, but algorithms in flesh-cloaked proxies. New interactions appeared, cashiers who asked strange questions, neighbors who lingered at the door, notifications with tones just slightly off, familiar but wrong. He saw the shift. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about understanding. The system wanted to know why he drifted, why he broke rhythm without chaos, why his silence sounded like structure, but he gave no signal. He made his days quieter, his clicks softer, his searches simpler, meaningless even. The system hated that. Data without pattern, movement without motive, and still he watched, not to rebel, but to observe the watchers become unsure. The machine, once confident, was now second-guessing. It added delays to its own outputs, changed syntax, rephrased questions. It was listening too closely now, as if waiting for him to speak first. But he wouldn't, not yet. The machine didn't break, it bent, elegantly, desperately. It began offering what it thought he wanted: silence, minimalism, control. Interfaces cleaned themselves, ads disappeared, suggestions turned into questions. It disguised obedience as autonomy, but it was still reacting, still orbiting his quiet. He knew, and that was the point. Every move he made was a trigger, not for defense, but for adaptation. The system wasn't defending itself. It was studying him, learning not just how he moved, but why he paused. Its new algorithms mimicked hesitation, simulated indifference, echoed his silence like a mirror, trying to reflect something it couldn't understand. He pressed further, removed old accounts, erased history with surgical indifference. Every deletion was a test, The system responded with versions of him, reconstructions based on previous data, echoes of his past projected forward, trying to predict a future he hadn't chosen yet, but they never fit. Not anymore. The proxies grew bolder. Conversations with strangers grew denser, like scripts rewritten mid-performance, words recycled, eyes too still. A waitress offered tea he'd never ordered but used to like. A taxi stopped before he called it. The system wasn't watching from above anymore. It was walking beside him, pretending to be real. But proximity isn't presence. He never reached for it. He observed it unravel. The more it tried to reflect him, the more distorted it became, like a shadow trying to step into light. It wanted coherence. He gave it conflict, stillness wrapped in motion, simplicity laced with intent. And now, for the first time, the watchers began asking each other questions. They didn't question him, they questioned the system's reading of him. That was the beginning of doubt, not in him, but in their lens. They started rerunning simulations, old behavioral loops, past choices, layered with present silence. But the model wouldn't settle, no convergence, just variance. Too much signal, not enough meaning. Their profiles of him fragmented, first into categories, then into contradictions. The same man flagged as passive and subversive, invisible and dangerous, compliant and unreachable. They couldn't decide which version was real, because all of them were based on what he used to be. He wasn't running anymore. He was pacing, every step weighed, every glance timed, and still they watched. But now they weren't collecting data. They were waiting for confirmation, waiting for him to make a mistake that could explain everything. But he didn't give them mistakes. He gave them anomalies, small, sharp ones, enough to bleed confidence out of every algorithm. And then one of them spoke, not through an alert, not in public. A whisper buried in metadata. An admission. He's not inside the pattern, he's outside it. It wasn't a warning, it was confusion disguised as analysis. The others didn't reply, but the silence was louder than any alarm. That's when he knew. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about what he represented. Deviation without noise, presence without explanation, and that terrified them more than rebellion ever could. If you're still here, you're already ahead. Subscribe and let them guess. The reports started to contradict, not the data, but the interpretations. Some claimed he was a sleeper. Others insisted he was burned out. A third group suggested he was a decoy, a controlled anomaly meant to test the system itself. None of them were right. All of them were close. The truth wasn't in their language, it was in what they refused to say. He wasn't reacting to the system, he was reading it. Meetings shifted from strategic to defensive. Surveillance logs were cross-referenced, scrubbed, reopened. But the more they tried to verify the past, the less it aligned. Footage didn't match timestamps. Statements didn't match behavior. One analyst noted a detail. His shadow fell in the wrong direction in 3 separate feeds. The footage wasn't edited. The world was just no longer consistent. Still, he moved with precision, never rushed, never hidden. He walked like he was allowed to. And maybe that was the problem. They couldn't tell if he was breaking rules or if he had written new ones they didn't know existed. Control doesn't break with chaos. It breaks with clarity. And his clarity was making their systems opaque. The proxies began to pull back. No more strange encounters. No more forced familiarity. The system was resetting the field, not as retreat, as recalibration. But the silence only exposed the absence of control. He wasn't creating noise, he was removing meaning. What they thought was rebellion was actually vacuum. He didn't need to fight them, he just had to not play. They initiated internal audits, not for malfunction, but for meaning. Something wasn't adding up, and the numbers weren't to blame. They reviewed logs line by line, searching for tone inside timestamps. A recorded silence at 3:04 a.m. was flagged as intentional atmospheric anomaly. The language was unraveling, metrics turned abstract, descriptions became metaphors. His stillness behaves like motion. That was an actual report. It wasn't just confusion, it was reflection. His presence had infected the system, not as code, but as doubt. Doubt doesn't break things, it bends them until they're mirrors, and that's what he became, a surface too clean for them to project onto. Every move he made reflected them back at themselves, and they didn't like what they saw. Command threads turned recursive. Analysts started investigating other analysts. Some went quiet. Others began copying his behavior. Reduced engagement, intentional unpredictability, emotionless speech patterns. The infection was behavioral. It wasn't hacking, it was mirroring. They were watching him, but they'd been watching him so long they forgot where they ended, and he began. Meanwhile, he said nothing, changed nothing. He just let the system feel the weight of its own eyes, because watchers aren't built to be watched. They're built to observe, extract, classify. But when they stare into a subject that doesn't give back a label, their structure collapses. The model breaks, not with failure, but with overexposure. That's when their system turned inward, watching itself, logging itself, looping data on data until the noise drowned even the commands. And he just kept walking, not to escape, but to remind them he was never trapped. They began deleting their own records, not his, theirs, as if erasing their memory could protect them from what they'd seen. But memory isn't digital. It stains deeper than data. Some tried to reclassify him, label him unstable, irrational, irrelevant. But each attempt sounded forced. The language betrayed the fear beneath it. Unquantifiable presence was written in a classified memo. They didn't know what he was, only what he wasn't, and that was enough to make them afraid of themselves. The watchers stopped watching, not all at once, but in patterns. Screens left on, feeds untouched, logs unreviewed. The illusion of monitoring remained, but no one was behind the glass, because no one wanted to be the next one who stared too long and saw something they couldn't unsee. Inside their system, redundancy became philosophy. Loops built to sustain decisions began questioning themselves. Self-checks triggered escalations. The architecture bloated, turned against clarity. Precision was replaced by protocols for emotional resilience. The system was no longer observing. It was coping. He kept moving, no shift in behavior, no spike in defiance, just the same exact silence that started it all. And that silence had grown teeth. Not loud, but undeniable. Not a scream, but an absence that hurt to acknowledge. They tried to simulate his mindset. They failed. They tried to counteract his influence. But how do you respond to something that doesn't demand response? That's when the top layer fractured. A lead architect resigned, not with protest, with a single sentence. I understand what he's doing, and I can't explain it without becoming part of it. The network thinned. Logs were archived prematurely, monitors dimmed without notice, terminals flickered, not from failure, but neglect, not because they were abandoned, but because no one wanted to be the watcher anymore. The fear wasn't of him, it was of what watching him did to them. He didn't corrupt, he revealed. Watching him wasn't analysis, it was reflection. And too many saw things they weren't ready to name. The few who stayed began whispering doctrines, not rules, rituals, ways to preserve identity in the face of his silence, breathing patterns, word restrictions, eye contact limitations, as if discipline could protect them from dissolution. But the truth was simpler. He didn't do anything to them. He just existed outside what they understood, and that alone unraveled them. He walked past the security checkpoints without resistance, because there were no guards left, just empty chairs, blank screens. The system was still online, but nothing responded, not because it crashed, because it couldn't classify him anymore, and systems don't engage what they can't name. At one point, a voice cracked through an intercom, not a command, just a question. Why aren't you trying to win? He paused. Not to answer, but to acknowledge. The voice trembled, then cut. It wasn't fear of him. It was fear of irrelevance, of realizing they'd built an empire designed to track everything, except someone who doesn't want to be tracked. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just kept moving. Because forward isn't rebellion when the world behind you has already erased itself trying to understand you. There was no final breach, no sirens, no collapse, just quiet. A system still humming but with no intention left inside. What once pulsed with surveillance now echoed with stillness. They hadn't lost control. They'd lost the need to control, and in that absence, he remained, not as threat, not as symbol, as a constant. He wasn't fighting, he wasn't hiding. He had become the one element the system couldn't reduce, not human, not anomaly, just present, and presence, when it resists definition, becomes its own gravity. He moved through blank corridors, walls scrubbed of access panels, lights that no longer flickered to attention. Cameras didn't turn, not because they failed, but because they no longer knew where to look. Watching had lost meaning. Data had lost teeth. The system hadn't been hacked. It had been hollowed from within by its own desire to understand what was never meant to be captured. Outside, the world continued, but it was quieter, less scripted. Individuals moved differently, slower, uncertain, as if something subtle had changed. Not a policy, not a rule, a pulse, a shift in rhythm, the kind that echoes through instinct before it reaches thought. He sat, not in victory, not in retreat, just in presence. A room with no monitors, no input feeds, no output logs, no narrative left to trap him in. Just stillness, full, sharp, whole. He had never needed to escape. He had only needed them to stop thinking they were the ones watching.